Indoctrination.
That's right.
Well, Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
Dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not how this works.
Well, hello there and welcome to Nowhere to Hide. I'm Brian Hyde. I'm glad you could join me this evening. And I've got to start out with a fond farewell to Betsy Russell. I just got news that she's going to be retiring after a news career spanning 4 decades. Betsy has been one of the publishers and I believe one of the main editors of the IdahoPress.com website. She's also been one of my favorite sources for material when it comes to finding bias in media. And I've also had the added bonus of seeing her outrage when being called out on that. And, you know, it's Betsy, it's been fun, but now I guess we're going to have to find other journalists, quotation marks, that are likewise as objective, wink, wink, as you are. Thankfully, there are more than a few out there. So I wish her the very best in retirement. I hope that she can break out of that little bubble, that echo chamber of journalists who think just like she does. And, you know, we'll give her awards and pat her on the back. And maybe she'll actually get to see a little bit of the real world out there and see that those of us outside of that little bubble are pretty normal folk as well. So today's theme is double standards. Do they count as standards? Because we got a couple of pretty good examples. Now, I'm going to start with a poll from the Statesman. 63% of Idahoans agree that public dollars belong in public schools. Now, I just have to ask this question. Where do those public dollars come from? Anybody want to take a shot at that? If you said, well, they come from private citizens who are taxpayers, that is correct. So when we're being conditioned to believe that, well, if they're public dollars and they have to stay in the public, but the public sector cannot create wealth. It can only take wealth from private sector actors, individuals, businesses that are creating wealth. So let's not confuse it too much. But they say that in this poll, 63% of Idahoans agree public dollars belong in public schools. And to take that just one step further, Rick Just for Idaho says Idaho parents can choose to send their children to whatever traditional public school they want. They can send them to charter schools, magnet schools, private schools, even homeschool them, but let's not spend public money on private schools. So in other words, yes, parents, if you want to exercise your choice, why, you can certainly do so, but you will be required under threat of, you know, people coming and taking you away and putting you in jail if you don't pay your taxes to fund those government-run school systems. And then if you want to, you know, educate your kids in homeschool or private schools or something like that, you can pay for that yourself. But you're going to get hammered both times. I don't know. I kind of like the idea of maybe those private dollars should follow the students by staying in the hands of private parents before they become public, so to speak. A little something to think about. Let's talk about another double standard here. This is an interesting one, a story that is garnering quite a bit of discussion in and around Boise. The Boise mayor's office now launching an investigation of a retired police officer's participation in what they're calling a white nationalist conference. Now, I don't know if we're supposed to make the association, well, if it's white nationalist, that must be the same thing as white supremacist. Are these guys on a par with the Ku Klux Klan or the Aryan Nations or something like this? The article never really says. I think there's the obligatory fear-mongering by the Southern Poverty Law Center, which is a very well-funded think tank of public alarmists who are basically there to smear anybody who falls to the right of Karl Marx. But we're told that this former police officer spoke at a conference recently and was apparently speaking there under an assumed name. And I believe the topic he was speaking on was the vilification of police and what that means for America. Now, I'm going to show you, this is an article from KIVI television, and the American Renaissance Gathering, which is where this officer spoke. The website's About Us tab says, we also believe that whites, like all racial groups, have legitimate interests that must be defended. The defense of those interests is white advocacy. We seek to advance only those interests that we recognize and would defend for all other racist groups. Well, these guys aren't very good racists if they're going to defend other racist groups. Don't they understand? Racism is all about your own tribe. It's all about, you know, everything for us and nothing for them. Anyway, moving on. We seek no advantages as whites, only the expression of preferences for our own people and culture that are taken for granted by people of other races, but denied to us. Now, I get it. This may not be your cup of tea. This may not be my cup of tea. But where is the hate? Where is the racism that's inherent in their stance? And the reason I ask is because there's a very clear double standard that's at work here. If this were a black police officer and he was speaking to, you know, a group of black advocacy people, well, then, there would be no one so much as raising an eye. But, oh, you put that word white in front of it and suddenly, oh, it's a terrible thing. I mean, the Police Chiefs Association and various other organizations now all falling all over themselves to prove how woke they are and how supportive they are of, we never discriminate and nobody should ever discriminate. Look, I'm not trying to make the case that any kind of supremacy is a good way to go. Frankly, I think the golden rule is really the approach that everybody should take because it works, regardless of what a person's skin color is, regardless of what group identity they may most closely identify with. If you treat people the way that you would want to be treated, I don't see how you can go wrong. But it just seems like there's much ado about nothing here. And the reason I say that is because here's a story that broke a couple of years ago about a Boise City Council member who says she's not going to have kids because of white people. This was published in the Idaho Dispatch in June of 2020. Now, this city council member, her name is Lisa Sanchez, told her Facebook followers she chose not to have children because she fears white people will abuse or kill her child. So my question is, why does she get a pass? Why doesn't that generate some outrage? I mean, that's a pretty broad brush she's painting with. Seems like a pretty big double standard. And again, I come back to the idea. Treat people the way you would want to be treated. I don't know how you could go wrong. But it's also kind of coincidental that the people who are most adamant about finding and stamping out racism seem to be the ones spreading it the furthest. Curious how that works. But hey, what do I know? Yeah, just a white guy. Probably my opinion doesn't matter for anything. All right, here's another story that again jumped out from the headlines. This is from idahopress.com. Look at this. Meridian Library pushes back on activist book banning efforts. Oh, those book banners are back at it again. Why on earth would they be banning books? Well, it turns out that the discussion over what is appropriate and what is inappropriate in the library is still very much a thing. And Brian Allman, who publishes the Gem State Substack, actually was asked to comment for this story. He's recently been appointed to the Eagle Library Board. And there was kind of a trap that was set for him in that the reporter was asking him, when you say that you're there to serve all people, does that include LGBTQ plus materials? And he says, I could see where she was going. And sure enough, she still portrayed it as anybody who doesn't want these materials readily available to kids is a book banner. Brian says they just can't help repeating the lines that this is about banning books rather than keeping harmful materials out of the hands of children. If a grocery store is cited for allowing children or teenagers to buy cigarettes, nobody accuses the police and the government of trying to ban cigarettes. He says, we as a society understand that some things are meant for children and some for adults. Yet there's been a nationwide push to erase the boundaries between childhood and adulthood, and teaching children about LGBTQ plus ideas is part of that push. A large group of citizens in Meridian have stood up to say stop. Now they're being tarred as racists, Nazis, and book burners. And I like how he boils this down. He says, look, the controversy here is we're talking about what is normal. And if the new LGBTQ plus value system is correct, well, then we really are a bunch of bigots who just want to harm people we disagree with. If they are right, we have no reason for opposing them, for refusing to recognize gay marriages, for refusing to use their preferred pronouns, for trying to keep our children from their explicit materials. Now, on the other hand, what if the traditional system is correct? What if there really are only two sexes? What if families with a father and a mother really are the best, not only for the children involved, but for the community as a whole? If that is the case, then is it not a moral imperative to protect our children from this alternate value system? One that we believe is not only inconsistent with the natural world, but actively harmful to our children themselves. He concludes by saying, the question I ask in the title is the one that this controversy dances around. What is normal? Is it the idea that there are two sexes and that families are typically composed of a father, a mother, and children? Humanity has thought so since the beginning of time. Activists today are trying to change that idea, attempting to normalize a novel worldview and claiming that 100,000 generations of mankind were wrong and they are right. Not only that, but they cast anyone who still holds the traditional worldview as bigots, Nazis, and other epithets. He says, I believe it's entirely rational and appropriate to stand up and say, no, I disagree. By the way, if you haven't subscribed to Brian's Gem State Substack, it's gemstate.substack.com. I really recommend that you take a look at his writings. You may or may not agree, but there are very few really reasonable voices out there, and I think Brian is one of the best. When I read his stuff, I'm not left with this ideological aftertaste that's like, oh, wow, he really was pushing that hard. I get the impression that this is a person who thinks deeply about the things he's writing about and is really seeking to find that common ground and find not only what is right, but doing so in a way that it's not branding other people as, some horrible misfits that we should be throwing trash at as they walk down the street. If only his opponents could take that same kind of a high road. I'm Brian Hyde, and this is Hyde in Plain Sight.
Are biased, the Idaho Press Club are biased, all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Well, Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
Dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not how this works.